Your American history class skipped the worst parts. I'm talking about a secret plot to overthrow the president, soldiers marched straight toward a nuclear blast on purpose, and a police force that dropped a bomb on its own city. All of it real, all of it proven, most of it locked away as top secret for years. This is the stuff America tried to bury. We start 500 years ago, before America was even a country. Let me start with the very first one, and it's a big one. Long before America was a country, this land was full of people. Somewhere between 10 and 18 million of them, spread across whole nations with their own cities, farms, languages, and trade routes. Then, the settlers arrived from Europe, and by the year 1900, fewer than 300,000 of those people were left. That is one of the biggest population collapses in all of human history, and a big chunk of it was done on purpose. The first wave of death came from disease. The European settlers carried sicknesses like smallpox, and the native people had never been near anything like it, so their bodies had no way to fight it off. Whole villages died in a matter of weeks. That part was mostly an accident, but not all of it. Back when Britain still ran the American colonies, its commanders wrote letters to each other about a truly nasty trick. They would hand out blankets from a smallpox hospital to native people at peace meetings, hoping to kick off a deadly outbreak of smallpox on purpose. And the wild thing is they wrote it all down. We still have those letters today. The next thing they did to Native Americans was also written down. Over about 200 years, the US government signed more than 400 treaties with native nations. A treaty is just an official agreement, and every one of these promised land and protection forever. They broke all of them. Every single treaty got torn up, forced into a worse deal at gunpoint, or quietly canceled by Congress the moment that land turned out to be worth something. The most famous broken promise even has a name: the Trail of Tears. Back in 1830, President Andrew Jackson pushed through a law to force entire native nations off their own land. The Cherokee fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the country, and won. The court ruled it flat out illegal. Jackson ignored it completely. So in 1838, under the next president, federal troops rounded up around 16,000 Cherokee at gunpoint and marched them more than 1,000 miles to Oklahoma in the dead of winter. The cold and the hunger killed about 4,000 of them on the way. But the darkest part came later, and it was aimed straight at children. Starting in the 1870s, the government began taking native kids from their parents by force and shipping them to special schools built to erase everything about who they were. The man who founded the first one said the goal out loud: kill the Indian, save the man. Children were beaten for speaking their own language. A lot of them never made it home, and in just the last few years, investigators have started uncovering unmarked graves at these old school sites. And the government had a name for all this, printed right there on the official paperwork: civilization. These schools weren't some dusty thing from the distant past either. The government didn't pass a law to finally stop pulling native kids into them until 1978. The first Star Wars movie was already out. So that was the beginning, back when America was brand new. It did not get gentler with age. Fast forward to 1933, when a handful of the richest men in the country cooked up a plan to overthrow the president himself. At the time, America was on its knees. The country was deep in the Great Depression, the worst crash in its history. Banks had shut their doors, 1 in 4 people had no job, and folks were lining up around the block just to get a loaf of bread. A brand new president, Franklin Roosevelt, had just promised to fix the whole mess by taxing the rich and using that money to create jobs. A lot of very wealthy men hated that idea, so a handful of them got together and cooked up a fix of their own. They were going to remove the president by force. It was called the business plot, and I know how that sounds, like something off the back of a cereal box. Except, Congress investigated it and confirmed the whole thing was real. The plan went like this. A group of rich bankers and business owners wanted to throw Roosevelt out and replace him with the kind of all-powerful dictatorship Hitler was building over in Europe. For that, they needed an army, and they knew where to find one. World War I had ended about 15 years earlier, dumping 500,000 former soldiers back into America with no jobs and no money. These were men who knew how to fight and were furious about being broke and forgotten. All they needed, the plotters figured, was someone to follow. So they went after the most trusted soldier in the country, a Marine general named Smedley Butler. The man was a living legend, one of the most decorated soldiers America had ever produced. If anybody could get 500,000 angry veterans to march on Washington, it was him. They sat Butler down and walked him through the whole thing. Raise a secret army, march it on the Capitol, force the president to step aside. They handed him every last detail. And that is exactly where their genius scheme fell apart. They had picked the wrong man. Butler was disgusted, but he did not throw them out. He smiled, played along, and quietly wrote down every name and detail they gave him. Then he carried the whole thing straight to Congress. A committee dug in and came back with a verdict. The plot was real, and powerful people were behind it. So this is the part where the rich guys finally go to prison, right? No, not even close. The biggest newspapers in the country, the New York Times included, ran stories mocking Butler as a liar who made it all up. And when Congress finally released its report, the names of the most powerful men had been quietly scrubbed out first. Nobody was arrested, nobody was even questioned, and the whole story vanished within a couple of weeks. So think about what almost happened. A group of men tried to overthrow the United States and turn it into a dictatorship, and not one of them paid a price? The only thing that saved the country was the one soldier they picked to lead it, deciding he would rather not. Turns out the rich could get away with just about anything. The business plot, at least, never made it past the planning stage. The next one did. It got typed up, signed by 5 men, and dropped on the desk of the man in charge of the entire US military. By 1962, America was deep in the Cold War, a long, tense standoff with the Soviet Union, the giant communist country that was America's main enemy. The two sides never fought each other face to face, but between them, they had enough nuclear weapons to end the world several times over. Then, a problem popped up 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a small island called Cuba. A few years earlier, in 1959, Cuba had a revolution, turned communist, and teamed up with the Soviets. So now America had an enemy parked on its doorstep, and it badly wanted Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro, gone. There was one catch. The American public was sick of war. They had just buried huge numbers of young men in World War II and Korea with no stomach for more. And you cannot exactly invade a country for no reason. People need something to rally behind. So, America's top generals landed on a solution. If there was no good reason to invade Cuba, they would simply invent one. This was Operation Northwoods, and it might be the most disturbing thing on this entire list. In March 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior generals and admirals who run the US military, signed off on a plan. The idea was for the American military to secretly carry out terrorist attacks on American soil, kill American civilians, and then pin the blame on Cuba. The fake outrage would hand America the perfect excuse to invade. They wrote the whole plan out in a detailed official document step by step. Here's some of what they proposed. Sinking boatloads of Cuban refugees out at sea, staging fake funerals for victims who never existed, blowing up an American ship in Guantanamo Bay Harbor, and setting off real bombings in cities like Miami and Washington, D.C. Attacks that would kill ordinary Americans in the street. Go back and listen to that list again. Yeah, these were the leaders of the US military, drawing up a plan to murder their own people just to start a war. This is all completely true, by the way, with proof. The document even had a dull, official-sounding name: Justification for US Military Intervention in Cuba. It went to the Secretary of Defense, the civilian in charge of the entire military, on March 13, 1962, approved by all 5 Joint Chiefs and signed by their chairman. Then it landed on the desk of President John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy said no. Within days, he killed the plan stone dead. The general who pitched it, a man named Lemnitzer, was quietly pushed out soon after and shipped off to command NATO forces in Europe. For 30 years, nobody knew any of this had happened. The document was stamped top secret and locked away. It finally surfaced in 1997, and today, anyone can read the whole thing in the National Archives. And the part that should rattle you is where it came from. The very top. Every one of the country's 5 most senior military commanders signed off on a plan to kill Americans. The only thing standing between that plan and dead Americans in the street was one president willing to say no. If you're learning something new, hit subscribe. I spent weeks digging through old reports and documents to find stories like these, and we've got a lot more coming. That time, the killing got stopped before it ever started. But roughly 35 years earlier, a different massacre went ahead with nothing and nobody to stop it. The people gunned down that night were not even American, and the reason they died comes down to one thing: bananas. It's the dead of the night in December 1928. In a small town called Cienega in Colombia, down in South America, thousands of workers are packed into the town square, waiting to speak with a government official. What they cannot see is that soldiers with machine guns are quietly fanning out around them in the dark. These workers picked bananas. They worked on a massive plantation owned by the United Fruit Company, a giant American business that grew and shipped bananas all over the world. And you can still buy their fruit today because that same company is now called Chiquita. The trouble had been building for weeks. The workers had been on strike since November, and the 25,000 strikers were asking for pretty basic stuff: written contracts, a 6-day work week instead of 7, and a little money if they got hurt on the job. But United Fruit would not part with a single cent. Instead of sitting down to talk, the company called up the most powerful friend it had, the United States government. The US ambassador to Colombia, America's top official in the country, fired off an urgent message to Washington warning that American property was in danger. Then came the part that really mattered. Word reached Colombia that if it did not shut the strike down, American warships might be on their way. The message was simple: handle your workers, or we will come and handle them for you. So, Colombia handled it. The government sent in the army. The soldiers told the workers to gather in the town square for a big meeting with the regional governor. It was a trap. At 1:30 in the morning, the troops surrounded the sleeping crowd and opened fire on them, men, women, and children. The Colombian government later put the death toll at 47. Almost nobody believes that. Real estimates run from several hundred to well over 1,000. And the reason we will never know the true figure is genuinely sickening. According to survivors, the bodies were loaded onto banana freight trains, hauled to the coast, and dumped into the sea. After the shooting, the Colombian government locked the whole region down and stripped people of their basic rights, all to keep United Fruit's business humming along. And how did America react to a massacre carried out to protect an American company? It sent a message congratulating Colombia on handling things so well. United Fruit, for its part, faced no consequences at all. It grew into one of the most powerful companies on the planet, powerful enough to get America to help topple entire governments across Latin America whenever a country got in the way of its land. In 1990, it took on the name Chiquita to freshen up its image, but old habits die hard. In 2007, Chiquita admitted in court that it had been paying a violent armed group in Colombia, one the US itself had branded a terrorist organization. It got off with a fine. So, a company got its own workers gunned down and just carried on selling bananas. The next horror on our list had nothing to do with money. This time, the US government turned its own soldiers into test subjects and marched them straight toward an exploding nuclear bomb. Imagine a stretch of empty desert in Nevada in 1951. Thousands of American soldiers are crouched in trenches, waiting. A few miles away sits a live nuclear bomb, and their orders are to walk toward it the second it goes off. World War II had ended 6 years earlier, finished by 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan. And now, America was terrified the next big war would be nuclear too. The military had one burning question: could regular soldiers keep fighting right after a nuclear bomb went off? There was only one way to find out. Test it on real men. Between 1951 and 1957, the military ran a string of exercises called Operation Desert Rock out there. The plan was simple and completely unhinged. Put thousands of soldiers in trenches, set off a real nuclear bomb nearby, then order them to climb out and march straight toward the mushroom cloud. Some ended up less than 2 miles from the blast. The whole point was to study how troops would hold up on what the military called an atomic battlefield. The soldiers were basically lab rats in army boots. The really evil part is what a nuclear blast actually does. The explosion is only the opening act. It also floods the air with radiation, invisible energy that soaks into your body and quietly wrecks it from the inside, often causing cancer years later. These men got almost no protection. They walked in wearing their regular uniforms. But it gets worse. A lot of the soldiers wore little badges that measured how much radiation they were soaking up. Before some of the tests, the men were ordered to take those badges off, and plenty of the badges they did keep turned up damaged or they vanished from government records, almost as if somebody did not want a paper trail. On top of that, the soldiers were told to keep their mouths shut and never speak about what they had seen. All told, somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 American troops were exposed to radiation across 69 separate nuclear explosions. Then, the cancer started. Year after year, these veterans came down with leukemia and lymphoma at rates far higher than normal. So they went to the government for help, asking for the care owed to any soldier hurt while serving. And the answer, over and over again, was no. The government flatly denied that the radiation had anything to do with their illnesses. The documents that could have proven the link were conveniently still classified. For decades, the official line was that the radiation doses had been perfectly safe. That turned out to be a lie, and the government's own secret records proved it the moment they were finally released. The atomic veterans fought for recognition for nearly 40 years. Congress finally passed a law to pay them in 1990, but the payouts were capped at a tiny amount, and the application was made so hard that many men just gave up. And a huge number of those marched into the blast zones never saw a single dollar. They had already died waiting. Those soldiers at least knew a bomb was about to go off nearby. The people in our next story got no warning at all. In the spring of 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the richest black neighborhood in America. Within a day, it was ash. By the time the sun came up, 35 city blocks were gone. Hundreds of people were dead, and 10,000 had nowhere left to live. People called Greenwood by another name, Black Wall Street. To see why that name mattered, you have to understand how America worked back then. Black Americans were shut out of white banks, shops, and hotels by law. So the black community of Tulsa built their own version of everything. Greenwood had its own banks, hotels, law offices, and theaters. One of the wealthiest black neighborhoods anywhere in the country, built from nothing. Plenty of white people in Tulsa hated watching a black community thrive. All it took to set the whole thing off was a single spark. That spark came on May 30th when a black teenager was accused of bothering a white girl in an elevator. The accusation was almost certainly false, but the truth did not matter. By the next night, an armed white mob had gathered, set on burning Greenwood to the ground. And this is where it turned from an ugly riot into something far darker. The Tulsa police were right there in the thick of it. Officers joined the mob and started handing the white attackers guns and ammunition, supplies pulled straight from the local National Guard, the state's part-time army. The city itself was now arming the very people doing the burning. Small airplanes appeared in the sky over Greenwood. Witnesses described those planes firing down at people and dropping firebombs onto the rooftops. Many people call it the first time an American city was ever attacked from the air. Historians still argue over exactly what those planes did, but nobody disputes they were circling the neighborhood during the attack. By the next morning, Greenwood was gone. Around 1,200 homes had burned. Somewhere between 100 and 300 people were killed. And then the police did something genuinely sick. They turned on the victims. They rounded up the black survivors and locked thousands of them in holding camps, while the men who had torched the neighborhood simply walked free. Then came the cover-up. When survivors filed insurance claims to rebuild their homes, the claims were denied. A grand jury looked at the whole disaster and blamed the black community for starting it. Nobody was ever punished, and the city was not even finished. The story got quietly scrubbed from Oklahoma's school textbooks, so kids grew up never knowing it had happened. Then in the 1960s, the city used government money meant for improving neighborhoods to bulldoze whatever was left of Greenwood all over again. It took until 2001, a full 80 years later, for Oklahoma to officially admit the massacre had even taken place. When an investigation finally dug into it, the report laid the blame squarely on the city of Tulsa and said the survivors should be paid back. That recommendation was ignored. Tulsa burned in a single night. The next thing on our list spread its damage over 10 whole years and across entire countries, poisoning millions of people. And the American company that made the poison knew exactly what it could do. America spent the 1960s bogged down in a long, brutal war in Vietnam, a country in Southeast Asia, and the US military had a problem it could not crack. The enemy kept melting into Vietnam's thick jungle, popping out to attack and then vanishing back into the trees. So the Americans came up with a fix that only a military could dream up. If the jungle was the problem, they would kill the jungle. Their weapon was a chemical called Agent Orange. Between 1961 and 1971, US planes sprayed about 20 million gallons of it across Vietnam and the nearby countries of Laos and Cambodia. The program had a tidy name: Operation Ranch Hand. The goal was defoliation, which is just a fancy word for killing every plant and tree so the enemy had nowhere to hide, and no crops left to eat. And it worked. The jungle died. But nobody mentioned the catch. Agent Orange was loaded with a poison called dioxin, one of the most toxic substances ever made. It killed the plants, sure, but it also soaked into the soil and the water, and from there, straight into people. Soldiers and civilians breathed it in and drank it for years without having any idea. The damage was horrifying. Dioxin causes cancer and nerve damage, and it does something even crueler. It causes severe birth defects, babies born with terrible disabilities. American soldiers who served in Vietnam came home and started developing strange cancers. Their children were born sick. Something was very clearly wrong. The official story, meanwhile, was a flat denial. For years, the government swore that Agent Orange was perfectly safe for humans, nothing to worry about, even as its own studies quietly said the exact opposite. Then the truth came out in court. In the 1980s, veterans sued the companies that had made the chemical, and one of the biggest was a company called Monsanto. During the lawsuit, the company's own internal documents revealed the real scandal. Monsanto's scientists had known for years that the dioxin in Agent Orange was dangerous. They made the stuff. They knew full well it was poison, and they sold it anyway. The veterans' lawsuit settled in 1984 for $180 million. But the companies were slippery about it. They handed over the money while admitting no fault whatsoever, which meant that legally, they were never guilty of a thing. And over in Vietnam, the nightmare never really ended. The dioxin stayed in the soil and the water for decades after the last plane stopped spraying. Children kept being born with severe defects generation after generation. The poison had worked its way into entire family lines, reaching the kids and grandkids of the people first sprayed. The Vietnamese government estimates that the deaths and disabilities caused by Agent Orange run into the millions. America did eventually start paying for cleanup and health programs over there, but not until 2012, more than 40 years after the spraying stopped. And to this day, not a single company has ever been found legally responsible for what Agent Orange did to the people of Vietnam. Agent Orange was a poison aimed at a jungle that ended up hitting people. The next horrors on our list were aimed at people from the very start. The US government ran secret experiments on its own citizens, using them as lab subjects, and the people being tested had no idea it was happening. We start in Alabama. In 1932, government doctors recruited 399 poor black farmers into what the men were told was a free health program. The doctors said they were treating them for something called bad blood. That was a lie. The men actually had syphilis, a serious disease that slowly eats away at the body and eventually kills you, and the doctors had no intention of treating it. They just wanted to sit back and watch what the disease did to a human body over time. For 40 years, it was called the Tuskegee Study, and the most evil part is what came next. In the 1940s, a cheap, simple cure for syphilis arrived, a single shot of penicillin. The doctors had access to it. They could have saved every last one of these men. Instead, they hid the cure and kept right on watching them suffer and die. The study only got shut down in 1972, and only because someone on the inside leaked it to the press. By then, more than 100 of the men had died, and disease had spread to their wives, and some of their children had been born with it. Now, while all of that was happening, America's spy agency, the CIA, was running an experiment that sounds like pure science fiction. It was called MK-Ultra, and the goal was to crack the secret of mind control. Starting in 1953, CIA agents secretly dosed people with LSD, a powerful drug that makes you hallucinate and lose your grip on reality. Nobody asked permission. Agents simply slipped the drug to unsuspecting people and watched what happened. They ran these tests in hospitals, prisons, and universities on patients and inmates who were not aware that they were part of a secret program. Some victims were locked in total darkness and silence for weeks and zapped with electric shocks. One case shows just how twisted it got. A CIA scientist named Frank Olson had his drink secretly spiked with LSD by a coworker. 9 days later, he fell to his death from a 13th floor hotel window. The CIA called it a suicide, but when his family dug up his body decades later, a doctor found a head injury that had happened before the fall, which pointed toward him being attacked first. When all of this finally surfaced in the 1970s, the CIA director admitted that his predecessor had ordered nearly every MK-Ultra file destroyed before any investigator could get to them. There were big hearings in Congress. Not a single person was ever charged. And the damage from Tuskegee did not stop when the study ended. For generations afterward, many Black Americans deeply distrusted doctors and the whole medical system, terrified of being experimented on again. Researchers have traced that fear directly back to Tuskegee. The harm done in those 40 years is still being counted today. Our final story is one that sounds completely made up. An American police force in a major US city dropped a bomb on its own people from a helicopter. It happened in Philadelphia in 1985. It started with a group called MOVE, who blended Black activism with a back-to-nature way of living. They were a small community, all sharing a single house on a street called Osage Avenue, and they had a long, ugly history of clashing with the police. The city wanted them gone, and after years of fighting, the whole thing came to a head in May 1985. On May 13th, hundreds of police officers surrounded the MOVE house. What followed was a tense standoff, the kind of situation where neither side will back down. For most of the day, the police hammered the house with tear gas and blasted it with water cannons. Shots were fired on both sides, and still, the people inside, children among them, refused to come out. So the police commissioner made a call that had no business being made on an American street. He ordered his men to drop a bomb on the house. And they meant that literally. A police helicopter flew over the row house and dropped an actual explosive, military-grade C4 that the FBI had handed over. The idea was to blow apart a fortified bunker the group had built on the roof. Instead, it tore a hole in the house and started a fire. The city's own police force decided the way to end an argument with its own residents was to bomb them from the air. In America. In the 1980s. Then came the decision that turned a disaster into a massacre. As the flames climbed, the city's fire commissioner confirmed the order for his crews to stand back and let it burn. Firefighters were right there with their hoses, and they were told to do nothing. So they did. The fire spread fast, leaping from rooftop to rooftop and tearing through the entire block. When the smoke finally cleared, the scale of it was staggering. 11 people were dead, 5 of them children. 61 homes had burned to the ground, and 250 people, most of them ordinary neighbors who had nothing to do with move, were left with nothing. So surely, after a police force bombed a city block and killed 5 children, somebody finally faced justice. You can probably guess how that went. Not one official was ever charged. A special commission later studied the whole thing and ruled the bombing completely unjustified. It changed nothing. The city eventually paid out $1.5 million to settle lawsuits, and that was the only price anyone ever paid. Philadelphia did not even officially apologize until 2020, a full 35 years later. And there is one last detail that somehow makes an already unthinkable story worse. The year after that apology, in 2021, people learned that the remains of moved children who died in the fire had never been laid to rest. Bones recovered from the scene had been handed to universities and used by researchers sitting in storage for decades. The families of those dead kids were never told and never gave their permission. Alright, there was some crazy stuff in this video, but that is only the stuff that leaked out. Imagine what they've done that we don't even know about. And if you like crazy history stories, check out this next video. You're not gonna believe what we show you. I'll catch you next time.